try and unpack this. We're talking about a time, centuries ago, when two vast, complex worlds, Europe and India, really started bumping up against each other. Not just ships and trade goods, but ideas, beliefs, ways of life.
Right. And the question is, how did they actually see each other? What were those first impressions, those misunderstandings, those attempts to figure the other side out?
Exactly. It's a period, roughly 1500 to 1800, that's way more complicated than just, explorers showing up or empires clashing.
It really is. It's about this messy, super interesting process of trying to make sense of something or someone totally unfamiliar.
And that's what we're diving into today, how Europeans and Indians perceived each other during those crucial 3 centuries. We're going to be drawing heavily on a really insightful historical study, Sanjay Subramaniam's book, Europe's India, Words, People, Empires, 1500-1800.
Yeah, and what's great about this book is that it digs deep into the primary sources. We're talking about the actual accounts written by people who were there, Europeans and Indians, grappling with these encounters firsthand.
Think about those moments the source mentions, like the Mughal Emperor Jahangir getting a European globe and apparently questioning its accuracy.
Or Indian writers commenting on European habits, like maybe not bathing enough or lacking what they saw as proper toilet etiquette.
Right. It's those kinds of surprising, sometimes awkward details that reveal so much.
Definitely. So our mission for this deep dive for you listening is to explore these original voices together. We want to understand the different viewpoints, see how those views shaped how people interacted, and uncover some really fascinating details.
The goal is to cut through some of the later myths and give you a really well-informed picture of this specific, incredibly dynamic historical moment.
Sound good?
Let's do it. So where do we start? Probably right at the beginning of this period, around 1500, with the Portuguese arriving in the Indian Ocean.
Yeah, they were definitely among the earliest and most significant European players on the scene in India proper.
And their arrival immediately threw up some big conceptual hurdles, didn't it?
Huge ones. I mean, they had some prior experience with Islam from the Mediterranean world, but the sheer diversity of Indian religious beliefs and practices beyond that was, well, bewildering for them.
So they tried to simplify it.
Pretty much.
Yeah.
They often just lumped everyone else, Hindus, Buddhists, Jains, various local traditions, under this single, very broad category, Gentiles, which, as you said before, sounds quite dismissive.
It does. Like they were just trying to fit everything into boxes they already had.
Exactly that. When you encounter something radically unfamiliar, the natural tendency, or at least their tendency, was to try and understand it through analogy. That was one of their main modes of description.
Comparing Indian things to Christian things they recognized.
Precisely. So they'd look at major Indian pilgrimage centers, places like Benares, Puri, Tirupati, Kanchipuram, Ramesvaram, and describe them as the Gentile equivalent of Rome, or Santiago de Compostela, or Jerusalem.
I remember the source mentioning a specific example. Someone called Tirupati Rome to them.
Yeah, that was the chronicler Antonio Boccaro. It perfectly captures that analogical thinking, trying to grasp the function or significance of an Indian site by finding a parallel in their own religious world. They did the same with Buddhist shrines and relics, too, trying to find equivalents.
But analogy only gets you so far, right? Especially if the things aren't actually that similar.
Absolutely. So the other main strategy was the opposite. Contrast.
Highlighting the differences.
Radically so. Emphasizing how different, how alien Indian beliefs and practices were compared to Christianity. Often, this came with a judgment portraying them not just as different, but as fundamentally wrong or inferior.
So it was either it's like our thing, but a Gentile version, or it's completely unlike our thing and therefore bad.
That sums it up pretty well for those early descriptions. And this struggle, this difficulty in understanding, definitely extended to Indian religious texts.
They didn't really know what to make of the Vedas or Puranas.
Initially, not much at all. It took time. The source says that by the late 16th century, some Portuguese writers, at least the more learned ones, started to become familiar with the names of texts like Veda, Gestra, Purana, Agama.
So they knew of them, but maybe not the content.
Exactly. Understanding the actual content, the philosophy, the narratives, that was a much bigger challenge. The source mentions Diogo do Couto, a major chronicler trying to describe them, drawing on work by an Augustinian friar named Agostinho de Azevedo.
What did Couto say?
He described finding many books in their Latin, which they called Gerundum. Now, Gerundum is probably a garbled term, maybe derived from a Sanskrit or Tamil word, it's unclear. But he went on to say these books were divided into parts, And the originals, which he called Vedos, clearly referring to the Vedos, were divided into 4 parts, and these further into 52 parts.
So, an attempt to describe the structure, even if the names were a bit fuzzy.
Yet it shows an effort to grasp that there was a structure, a body of important texts, even if he's filtering it through a European lens of Latin, meaning a learned language, and concepts like originals and numbered divisions that might echo biblical scholarship.
Okay, let's shift from religion to society. This is where the source talks about the terms the Portuguese used, and it's really revealing about how language shapes perception.
It absolutely is, because the word we automatically associate with Indian society today, caste, wasn't the main term the Portuguese used, at least not in the early 16th century.
Really, what did they use instead?
They primarily used the word law in Portuguese.
Law. How did they mean law in terms of social groups?
The source explains that lie here meant something specific, a formal recognition of a social regulation which defines a limited group. It implied a stricter, more defined social boundary than looser terms like custom, costume, or use,
Oof.
uso,
And they applied this concept of law to different Indian groups.
widely. Duarte Barbosa, who wrote a really detailed account of society in Kerala in the early 16th century, is a key example. He uses lay constantly to describe the different communities he observed there.
What kind of things did he note about these laws?
He noted their distinct statuses, some higher, some lower, and critically, the strict rules about interaction, or rather non-interaction. He mentioned how these groups, defined by their lay, wouldn't mix, wouldn't eat together, wouldn't even touch each other, sometimes under pain of death. Using the term law really emphasized the perceived rigidity and formality of these divisions.
So if lay was the dominant term early on, when did casta come into play?
That's the crucial point the source makes. Casa appears very rarely in Portuguese writings from the first few decades of the 1500s.
So the idea that the Portuguese immediately imposed a caste system based on their own ideas isn't quite right.
It seems more complicated than that. There are modern scholarly arguments, like Sumit Gupta's, suggesting a link between the later use of casta and Iberian ideas about racial purity, limpieza de sangre, purity of blood. But Subramaniam, the author of our source book, points out that casta originally belonged to a broader group of terms the Portuguese used for lineage or group identity, words like nação, nation, estirpe, lineage, gente, people. And interestingly, its earliest uses were often for breeding lines in animals, horses, dogs, or even grape varieties.
So not primarily about human social hierarchy at first.
Apparently not. It seems lay was the more significant term for describing those structured social divisions initially. The shift towards casta becoming the primary systemic term happened later.
When did that shift occur and why?
The source pinpoints the change to around 1600. And it largely credits or blames, depending on your perspective, that same Augustinian friar, Agostinho de Azevedo, whose work Couto used. Azevedo wrote a text in the late 16th century titled, Of the Opinions, Rites, and Ceremonies of All the Gentiles of India.
And he tried to create a system.
Exactly. He wasn't just describing different groups. He tried to lay out a comprehensive scheme for understanding the entirety of Gentile Indian society.
And this is where the famous four castes idea really enters the European picture.
Yes, Azevedo presented a framework of cuatro castas, 4 castes, as the fundamental basis. He explicitly connected these to the ancient Sanskrit concept of the 4 varnas, although his understanding was likely based on South Indian informants. He even claimed his scheme came from a specific book he'd heard of from the Tamil country, calling it Jadegul Tutan, or Katika Tuyam, which means something like Orchard of Castes.
Did he describe these 4 castes?
Oh, in detail. He listed them. First, the Rayas, likely referring to Kshatriyas or ruling warrior groups, described as noble, involved in arms and governance, valued for fidelity. Second, the Brahmins, associated with priesthood, learning, scripture, seeking precedence, wearing sacred threads, having privileges like exemption from capital punishment, and being vegetarian. Third were the Chitins, likely Chettis or merchant groups, described as traders, very rich, highly esteemed, and crucial for state revenue. And fourth were the Balalas, probably VO farmers, also esteemed as they provided sustenance, and kings could apparently marry their daughters, which suggested high status.
And he didn't stop at 4, did he?
No, he elaborated further. He mentioned the idea that from these 4 main castes, 196 other castes were derived, and he included the South Indian concept of division into right-hand Phalangai and left-hand Idangai factions, stating that the left-hand castes were considered inferior and subject to strict rules about things like processions. He even admitted the Indians themselves sometimes argued about who ranked where because the rules were so ancient.
Wow, that's quite a detailed, if potentially simplified, structure he laid out. What was the impact of Azevedo's work?
This is the crucial part for understanding how European knowledge or perhaps misconception about India developed. Azevedo's text, this specific scheme he created, wasn't just some obscure manuscript. It was widely plagiarized.
Plagiarized by whom?
Most significantly, by Diogo de Couto. Couto incorporated huge chunks of Azevedo's description, almost word for word, into his hugely influential chronicle Da Asia, specifically in the Decada Quinta.
So Couto's work, which became a standard reference for Europeans wanting to know about Asia.
Exactly. It contained Azevedo's specific forecast model presented as authoritative fact. Later writers, dictionary compilers, encyclopedists, they would turn to Couto. They wouldn't necessarily know he was relying heavily on this one friar's interpretation, which might have been based on limited South Indian information and filtered through his own Christian framework.
So Azevedo's model essentially got locked in.
Pretty much, it became the standard European way of understanding Indian society through the lens of casta as a rigid, systemic, four-part hierarchy by around 1600. It persisted, not necessarily because it accurately reflected the complexity across all of India, but because it was readily available, systematically presented, and endlessly copied. It's a powerful lesson in how knowledge gets transmitted and sometimes distorted.
That really highlights how a single interpretation can ripple outwards and become accepted wisdom.
Okay, so the Portuguese were early players, but the European scene in India got much more crowded after 1600.
Definitely. You start seeing the English, the Dutch, the Danes, the French showing up in greater numbers, establishing their own trading posts and companies.
But you mentioned earlier that even the Portuguese presence wasn't monolithic.
No, not at all. Right from the start, there were non-Portuguese individuals involved: Spaniards, Italians, Germans. And interestingly, the source highlights people from Flanders, what's now Belgium, and parts of the Netherlands and France, particularly from cities like Antwerp and Bruges.
Flemings in India back then.
Yeah. There's a Flemish account called Calcone, printed in Antwerp in 1504, which is an eyewitness report of Vasco da Gama's second voyage. And later, in the early 17th century, you have the Coutre brothers, Jacques and Joseph from Bruges. They were jewelers and traders who spent years in India and Southeast Asia. Jacques even wrote a detailed account in Spanish, his Vita, about his experiences.
Why were people from Flanders involved? Well, some were skilled artisans, like artillerymen. And remember, for a period from 1580 to 1640, Portugal was ruled by the Spanish Habsburgs. This connection likely made it easier for people from the Spanish Netherlands, which included Flanders, to get involved in the Portuguese ventures.
So a multinational affair even early on, and after 1600, the diversity of Europeans just increased.
Absolutely. And it wasn't just about nationalities. It was about the types of people. They weren't all officials or soldiers representing a state. The source describes many as self-made men and occasionally women pursuing all sorts of occupations.
Like what?
Priests, obviously, but also artillery experts, translators, jewelers like the Coutre brothers, painters, builders, merchants of all kinds.
And you mentioned a key motivation for many of them making the long, dangerous journey east.
Social mobility. For many people, especially those not from the highest ranks of society, Europe offered limited opportunities for significant advancement or wealth. India, or the East Indies more broadly, seemed like a place where you could potentially make your fortune, rise in status, achieve things that were out of reach back home.
That makes sense. To get a feel for this diversity, let's look at a couple of contrasting examples the source provides. First, the Frenchman François Bernier. He's quite famous, isn't he?
Very famous, primarily for his book Travels in the Mughal Empire, which was hugely influential in Europe. But the source gives us a richer picture of him. He wasn't just some random adventurer. He had a superior formal education.
Right. He studied philosophy with Pierre Gassendi in Paris.
Yes, a major intellectual figure. Bernier defended Gassendi's work, traveled in Europe, got a medical degree from the prestigious University of Montpellier, and even knew important scientists like the anatomist Jean Piquet. So a well-educated, well-connected individual.
Why did he end up traveling to India then?
The source says his initial reasons for heading east around 1655, after Gassendi died, are still not entirely clear beyond the stereotypical desire to see the world. Standard grand tour, perhaps? He traveled through the eastern Mediterranean, spent time in Egypt dealing with a plague outbreak, visited Jerusalem, and then decided to push further east via the Red Sea ports like Jeddah and Mocha. He finally landed in Surat, the major Mughal port, in late 1658 or early 1659.
But he didn't just remain an independent traveler or physician?
No, his role shifted. When the newly established French East India Company, the Compagnie Royale des Indes Orientales, a project of Louis XIV's powerful minister Colbert, sent its first ships to Surat in early 1668, they sought Bernier out
Why him specifically?
because he was a known quantity. A patriotic Frenchman who had spent nearly a decade in the Mughal Empire, served at the court, understood the politics, the key players. He was perfectly placed to advise the fledgling French company.
And he wrote a confidential report for them.
This is one of the most fascinating parts. He wrote a memoir, Pour l'établissement du commerce dans les Indes, a memorandum on establishing trade in India. And crucially, as the source emphasizes, he never published this document during his lifetime.
Why not?
The source hints the reasons will become evident when you look at the content. It suggests a hidden agenda.
Ooh, intriguing. What did the memo say?
It contained very specific strategic advice. One phrase really stands out. It is not yet time. Il n'est pas encore temps.
Not yet time for what?
It strongly implies future French ambitions beyond just trade, perhaps political influence, or even power. But for the present moment, Bernier advised that the French approach needed to be one of concealment and dissimulation.
Hiding their true long-term goals.
Precisely. Playing the part of humble merchants for now. He then detailed who the key figures at the Mughal court were, that the French needed to cultivate the chief minister, Wazir, Jafar Khan, his son Namdar Khan, other officials like Mullah Saleh, Dana Khan, and his son Rustam Khan, whom Bernier calls our great friend who speaks Portuguese and Latin, interestingly. He also mentions Danishman Khan, another influential noble who had been Bernier's patron, as a potential ace in the hole, though relations with the Wazir were tricky.
So how did he advise the French company to actually approach these powerful figures, like the Wazir Jafar Khan?
His advice was very specific. Tactfully persuade the Wazir, disabuse him of any suspicion that the French had ulterior motives, frame their arrival as being purely for the good of Indistan, for the benefit of the Mughal Empire itself.
How could they possibly spin it that way?
Bernier crafted a clever narrative for them to use. The core message was, the French are the most industrious and the greatest workers among all the Franks, Europeans. France itself is the general workshop Karkhana of Frangistan, Europe, and a major warehouse for manufactured goods. However, France needs Indian commodities.
Okay.
He argued that, currently, the French are forced to buy Indian goods at inflated prices from middlemen, Italians, Ottomans, or worse, their rivals, the Dutch and English, who bring the goods directly from India. So the French people prayed to their king to form a company to trade directly with India. They would bring desirable French goods like scarlet cloth and take back Indian goods, cutting out the middlemen and benefiting both France and the Mughal Empire.
That's a very smooth pitch. We're just here to trade fairly and cut out the price gougers.
Exactly. And the brilliance of it, as the source points out, lies in the contrast. You have this public-facing narrative of the French as helpful, industrious traders seeking mutual benefit. But underneath, revealed in the unpublished memo with phrases like, it is not yet time, and concealment and dissimulation, is a hint of a longer-term strategy potentially involving French power and glory. It shows a really sophisticated, two-faced approach to establishing a European presence.
Calculated is the word. Now, for a complete contrast, the source brings up Augustin Hériard, also French, but very different from the intellectual, politically savvy Bernier.
Totally different background. Hériard was a jeweler from Bordeaux, and his career, as the source puts it, was unusual.
How so?
Well, the first trace we have of him is in London in 1604, and he's corresponding with Sir Robert Cecil, Queen Elizabeth I, and later King James I, chief minister, basically the head spy master.
A jeweler corresponding with the spy master.
Yeah. And apparently the correspondence suggests Hériard was engaged to produce false gems.
Counterfeit jewels. That's definitely not your typical merchant backstory.
No. It suggests someone operating on the fringes, perhaps with specific, slightly shady skills. Anyway, around 1609, he decides to travel to the Islamic world. We next find him quite a bit later, in 1625, at the court of the Mughal Emperor Jahangir in Lahore.
Did he explain how he got there?
Yes, he wrote a letter back to a French diplomat he knew, Charles Cauchon de Maupas. In it, Hériard explains that after meeting Maupas in London, he became known as a man of curiosity and an expert in counterfeiting precious stones. As he got older, his ambition grew. He wanted to perform some remarkable service to my king and lord to gain public esteem back home.
So he saw travel and service abroad as a path to recognition.
It seems so. He traveled East Egypt, Arabia, Mesopotamia, Persia, but apparently found nothing he considered worthy of a king. So he decided to push on to the court of the King of the Indies, Jahangir, presumably hoping to impress him with his skills or find some unique treasure or opportunity.
So, Bernier, the educated advisor with a long-term state strategy hidden beneath commercial rhetoric. And Herriard, the skilled craftsman, maybe a bit of a rogue, driven by personal ambition and perhaps a desire to leverage his unusual skills at a powerful foreign court. It really underscores the variety of Europeans heading east.
Absolutely. Different backgrounds, different skills, different motivations from state service and intellectual curiosity to pure personal gain and adventure. Now let's bring in another perspective.
The Dutch. The Dutch East India Company, the VOC, was obviously a major player. The source mentions an account by Wolbrant Galensen de Jong.
Yes, Gonson was a VOC factor, basically a company agent, who spent a lot of time in Gujarat in the first half of the 17th century. He knew places like Farooq, Surat, and Ahmadabad quite well.
What did he observe about a place like Baruch?
His description gives a sense of the diverse population. He noted it was pretty well peopled with Moors, Muslims, Binjans, Banayas, typically Hindu or chain merchants, and Persians. He specifically pointed out that the Banayas were the most numerous group, and that they controlled most of the trade, bringing the most business to the town.
Did he offer any opinions on the Banayas?
He did, and it's a classic example of European comparative judgment. He said they were not unlike the Chinese in terms of covetousness, though not quite so fraudulent as the former.
Ouch. A backhanded compliment at best, comparing stereotypes.
Exactly. It shows that tendency to categorize and judge based on pre-existing European notions about other groups.
But his observations weren't all just stereotypes, were they?
No, he also included more grounded details. He described local practices like giving alms to the poor and the existence of animal hospitals, which clearly made an impression. He even mentioned sprinkling his writing with the common Hindustan's proverb, suggesting at least some attempt to engage with the local language and culture, even if just superficially.
What about his views on the Mughal government?
Like many Europeans, he commented on what he saw as the arbitrary nature of Mughal rule, the oppression of the poor, and general injustice. But, and this is really striking, despite these criticisms, Galanson insisted that, quote, no one is hindered or harassed in their beliefs or godly worship, but instead, each one lives freely.
That's a powerful observation, especially considering the religious conflicts raging in Europe at the time.
It really is. It suggests a recognition, perhaps even an admiration, for a level of religious tolerance in Mughal India that contrasted sharply with the European experience.
Did he find any other points of connection?
Amazingly, yes. The source highlights a passage where Gellingson actively tries to find affinities, points of similarity, between Islam and the Protestant Christianity practiced by most of the Dutch. This deliberate search for common ground between seemingly very different faiths is quite a remarkable aspect of his account.
So, across these European accounts, Portuguese, French, Dutch, we're seeing a real mix. Attempts to categorize using analogy and contrast. Efforts to create systematic frameworks, like Azevedo's castes, personal quests for fortune and fame like Herriard's, strategic calculation like Bernier's, and even moments of appreciation for things like religious tolerance or attempts to find common ground, like with Galenson.
It's definitely not a simple, uniform picture.
Yeah.
And this period after 1600, especially with the Dutch and English becoming more established, also saw a growing impulse among Europeans to collect things from India.
Collect things, like souvenirs.
More than just souvenirs. We're talking about a more systematic collection of objects, yes, but also text, manuscripts, and paintings.
Why the increased focus on collecting?
The source links this partly to the rise of what's sometimes called a new Orientalism in Western Europe, starting maybe in the late 16th century.
Where did that come from?
Interestingly, it partly grew out of biblical scholarship. You had scholars, especially in places like Leiden University in the Netherlands, like Joseph Scaliger, studying languages like Persian, initially perhaps to help with chronological studies related to the Bible. Another Leiden scholar, Frans van Ravelingen, was promoting broader linguistic studies, comparing Persian with European languages.
So it started with language and religion, but broadened out.
Yes. While some continued to study the Orient primarily through a religious lens, maybe looking for arguments against Islam or trying to fit Indian religions into biblical history, like Louis de Dieu, others began to shift towards more secular subjects. History and politics became increasingly important.
Like the interest in Persian texts offering advice to rulers.
Exactly. Those mirror for princes texts, like Saidi's Golistan and Bostan, became quite popular. They offered moral tales and political wisdom. Scholars like Golius studied them, and translations started appearing in European languages. André Douillet translated them into French, George Gens into Latin. Europeans were clearly looking to these texts for insights into ethics and governance.
And they also started writing their own accounts of India using the information they gathered.
Right. Take Francisco Pelsart, that Dutch factor we mentioned earlier. He spent years in northern India, around Agra. Based on his experiences and likely information gathered from Indian clerks or translators in the Dutch factory, he compiled a chronicle, and a remonstranti, a report on the state of the Mughal Empire.
And these texts were influential.
Very. They became key sources for the geographer Johannes de Leith back in Leiden when he wrote his major work, the Imperio Magni Mogulus, on the Empire of the Great Mughal, published in 1631. This book became a standard European reference on the Mughals for decades.
So European knowledge was often built on these secondhand accounts, mediated through company employees and their local informants.
Often, yes, direct access to and translation of original Indian historical texts was still developing. The collection of actual manuscripts was happening, but it was a parallel process.
How were these manuscripts and other objects actually acquired? Was it just buying them? Sometimes, but not always. The source highlights the importance of the gift economy, especially in diplomatic contexts. Europeans seeking trading rights or political favors needed to present gifts to rulers and officials.
What kind of gifts worked best?
The Mughals, in particular, seemed interested in European novelties and technologies. So things like mechanical clocks, elaborate mirrors, musical instruments, scientific curiosities, but also European prints and illustrated books were common gifts, referred to as Schenkige Goederen by the Dutch.
The source mentions a particularly strange gift, something about a horse-headed man.
Yeah, that's a bizarre one. The Mughal chronicler Bhimsen recorded news arriving from Europe about a supposed supernatural being, Dev, with the head of a horse and the body of a human that had apparently appeared there. The Franks had supposedly captured it, it died, and then they sent a drawing or painting of it, Taswir, to the Mughal emperor as a curiosity.
Wow, that really shows the exchange of the exotic and wondrous going both ways in a sense. It does. Now, as we move later into the mid-18th century, the context of collecting starts to change, especially with the growing power of the East India companies.
How did it change?
While collection continued, the source notes that it sometimes involved methods beyond polite gift-giving or purchase. The phrase naked extortion is used.
That sounds ominous. So, using political pressure to acquire items.
It seems so. The source points to figures like Richard Johnson, who worked for the English East India Company in the late 18th century. He's described as an unscrupulous collector. While also an amateur musicologist, he apparently used his political leverage in places under company influence, like Awadh and Hyderabad, during the 1780s to amass a really significant collection of manuscripts, paintings, and objects.
We'll talk more about Antoine Polier later, but he was also collecting around this time.
Yes, Polier, the Franco-Swiss mercenary, was another major collector, often responding to specific requests from contacts back in Europe.
And did the meaning or use of these collected items change by, say, 1800?
The source argues that yes, there was a shift. Collection and representation became somewhat uncoupled. What did that mean? Well, while Europeans might still collect Persian historical manuscripts, for instance, these texts were increasingly less seen as the primary sources for Europeans to write the history of India. A chronicle like Farishta's might still be respected, but the authority was shifting.
Shifting towards European interpretations.
Largely, yes. And in terms of visual representation, Mughal paintings might be collected and appreciated for their aesthetic qualities, but the job of creating the real, authoritative visual record of India was increasingly seen as belonging to European artists and engravers.
The ones producing those picturesque landscapes and ruins.
Exactly. Often creating what the source calls an academic vision of India, which might focus on romanticized decay or idealized landscapes, rather than, say, the detailed court life or specific historical events depicted in Mughal miniatures. It points to a change in who controls the narrative and the image of India for a European audience.
That's a really important shift in power dynamics and knowledge production. Now, the source contrasts this European focus with Indian traditions of history writing.
It does. It talks about Tariq, a genre of historical writing often found in Persian and Urdu. This is contrasted with Khabar, which is described more like news reports, spontaneous, perhaps popular or anonymous. Tariq, on the other hand, was seen as more personal, a work that was consciously crafted, thought through, often relying on the copying of documents and archival material rather than just spoken accounts.
And it had a particular focus.
It tended to be the work of the literate elite, literati, and became increasingly focused on the state, the affairs of the court, the dynasty, rulers, and administration, whether at the imperial or regional level. The source suggests this strong focus on the state might have led to a narrowing of perspective compared to some earlier, potentially more diverse historical viewpoints in India.
The source even draws a surprising parallel to history writing in Iberia.
Yeah, it mentions possible connections between Indo-Persian Tariq and the tradition of historical writing in the Iberian Peninsula, possibly via figures like the great 14th century historian Ibn Khaldun, whose family had Andalusian roots. It's a reminder that these intellectual traditions weren't always isolated. There were potential connections across Eurasia, though tracing them precisely is complex.
And how did Portuguese historical writing compare?
The source notes that, compared to the Spanish, the Portuguese perhaps lacked a strong, continuous chronicling tradition for some time, especially concerning their overseas empire. However, it singles out a very important early figure, Fernão Lopes, who was the chief archivist of Portugal in the 15th century.
What was notable about Lopes?
He was incredibly prolific, and while he did use oral and popular sources, he also thought very deeply about the challenges of writing history accurately. He talked about the historian's main struggle being against affectation.
Affectation, what does that mean?
Affection, partiality, bias. Lopes saw it as the tendency to misrepresent events or distort the truth to please one's patrons, benefit one's country, or conform to expectations. He really stressed the need for rigorous research.
How did he propose achieving that?
He claimed he consulted vast numbers of books, sources in different languages, accounts from various lands, and delved into archives to find certainty. He believed historical error often came from simply accepting received opinions without critically examining the original ancient writings and authors.
That sounds remarkably modern for the 15th century, a real emphasis on source criticism and striving for objectivity.
It really does. And it provides a fascinating contrast with European traditions themselves to the later practices we saw, like Azevedo's potentially biased scheme being uncritically copied by Couto. It shows a diversity of thought within Europe about how to approach the past.
Okay, let's circle back to how Europeans tried to understand Indian religion, going beyond those initial modes of analogy and contrast.
Right. The source discusses the information used in that famous multi-volume work, Cérémonies et coutumes religieuses de tous les peuples du monde, Ceremony and Religious Customs of All the Peoples of the World, compiled by Bernard and illustrated by Picard in the early 18th century. For its section on India, it relied heavily on a text derived from the work of a Portuguese missionary, Father Bartolomeu de Brito.
How was Brito's text structured?
It seems to have been organized around the major deities, Brahma, Vishnu, Shiva, recounting their stories, myths, and adventures, particularly Vishnu's incarnations, avatars. It also apparently included descriptions of Indian ideas about paradise, hell, and the nature of the human soul.
So trying to map out the cosmology in a way Europeans could grasp?
Yes, likely fitting it into familiar theological categories. But the source highlights something particularly interesting about the final chapters of Brito's work.
What was that?
He apparently reflected quite seriously on the perceived affinity between what he called heathen doctrine and Christian doctrine.
Affinity. That sounds very different from just dismissing it as wrong or pagan.
It is. It's a much more conciliatory tone than you find in some other contemporary accounts, like that of Niccolò Manuzzi, another European in India, who basically dismissed Indian religion as nothing but a confused mixture of absurdities. Brito seemed to be looking for connections.
What was his argument for this affinity? How did he explain it?
His argument, as summarized in the source, was that if you really look closely at the core beliefs of these idolaters, you'd have to conclude that they were formally acquainted with the mysteries of the Christian religion.
So the idea was that ancient Indians actually knew Christian truths.
That seems to be his theory. He believed that the original truths they had received had somehow become insensibly changed over time, corrupted for want of evangelical preachers to guide them and keep the doctrines pure.
Ah, so it's a variation on that theme we saw earlier, the idea that Indian religion might be a distorted echo of some original, perhaps divine revelation, maybe even Christianity itself.
Exactly. It fit into those ongoing European debates about the origins of Gentile or heathen religions. Were they derived from the ancient Jews, as someone like Le Crecanier argued?
Hmm?
Were they fundamentally monotheists by natural instinct, as Henry Lord suggested? Or were they, as Brito proposed, effectively lost Christians whose original faith had decayed?
Did everyone buy Brito's theory?
Not necessarily. The source notes that even the editors of the ceremonies, Picard and Bernard, added a skeptical footnote to Brito's claims, stating curtly, all this is poorly proved.
But the very existence of these debates shows a deep, ongoing European effort to grapple with Indian religious ideas and somehow fit them into their own historical and theological worldview.
Absolutely. And it wasn't just abstract theorizing. The source quotes a letter from a Jesuit missionary, Jovenal Boucher, who was known for his work in cartography and astronomy in South India. He wrote to Bishop Pierre-Daniel Huet in France. Huet favored the theory of Jewish origins for Indian religion.
What did Boucher say?
He was confirming to the bishop that, based on his observations, the Indians are no ways tainted with the absurdities of atheism. Finding common ground, even if just agreeing they weren't atheists, was part of this process of trying to understand and categorize. It's also important to note, as the source points out, that most of this intense European debate and information gathering focused on the complex set of traditions they were beginning to group together and would later label as Hinduism.
What about Islam as practiced in India? Was that less of a focus?
Generally, yes, in this particular context of trying to understand the exotic religions of India. Europeans who were interested in Islam often looked to the Ottoman Empire or Persia for information. Even when a scholar like Enketil Duperon, who learned Persian in India, wrote a life of Muhammad, Vide Muhammad, it wasn't widely read.
Why was Indian Islam less interesting to them in this way?
The source suggests that the Indo-Persian textual tradition, while certainly studied by some, held a somewhat problematic epistemological status for the emerging field of European high Orientalism. It didn't quite fit the mold of the ancient mysterious Hindu texts they were often seeking.
Were there exceptions to this lack of interest?
Yes, particularly in northern India. The source mentions Jesuits like Joseph Tiefenthaler, who spent decades traveling and mapping in North India, and Francois Xavier Wendell, who served various Indian rulers. Figures like these seem to have been somewhat more open to engaging with the Indo-Persian culture and knowledge systems they encountered.
Okay, let's shift focus again, moving towards the later part of this period, the 18th century, and look at the role of Scots in India.
The Scottish presence definitely became more prominent, especially after the 1707 Act of Union joined Scotland and England into Great Britain, opening up more opportunities in the growing British Empire, including those offered by the East India Company. Though Scottish interest wasn't entirely new, the humanist historian George Buchanan was reflecting on Portuguese discoveries back in the late 16th century.
The source mentions a renewed academic interest in the role Scots played in India between about 1760 and 1830.
Yes, and it touches upon some of the speculative theories that have been proposed over the years to explain why Scots were supposedly particularly good at adapting to or synthesizing with Indian culture.
Speculative theories, like what?
Well, one rather vague idea was simply about supposed national characters, that Scots somehow had an innate affinity. Another, more specific theory suggested a kind of political empathy.
Empathy, how so?
The idea was that some Scots, maybe those whose families had suffered after the failed Jacobite Rebellion of 1745, might feel a certain sympathy for other colonized or subjugated peoples like those in India. A shared sense of grievance against dominant power, perhaps.
Interesting. And there was a third speculation mentioned related to gender.
Yes, this one focused on the relative scarcity of European women in India, especially in the earlier period. The theory suggested that Scottish men forming relationships often sexual with Indian women might have gained a unique kind of intercultural understanding and communication through these intimate connections.
And the source notes that major events later on are sometimes seen as changing this.
Right. Things like the Indian Rebellion of 1857, the Mutiny, and the opening of the Suez Canal in 1869, which made travel easier and led to more European women coming to India, are sometimes cited as factors that reduced this kind of close, informal interaction and led to more rigid social segregation.
But these are presented as just speculations, right? Not proven facts.
Exactly. The source flags them as historical arguments or speculations that have been made, not necessarily definitive explanations. To get a more concrete idea of Scottish engagement, let's look at a specific individual, James Fraser of Relig.
Fraser was working for the East India Company in the mid-18th century.
That's right. He joined the EIC as a writer, an entry-level clerical position, around 1730. His early service was in places like Mocha in Yemen, important for the coffee trade, and then Surat and Cambay, in Gujarat. He went back to Britain for a while, got married, and then returned for a second stint in India in the 1740s, mainly based in Surat again.
He actually published a book before his second trip out.
He did. His only Polish work, The History of Nadir Shah, came out in London in 1742. Nadir Shah, the Persian ruler who had invaded India and sacked Delhi just a few years earlier in 1739, was a figure of huge interest and anxiety in Europe, so Fraser's book was very timely.
Where did he get his information? He wasn't actually there for the invasion, was he?
No, but he positioned himself as knowledgeable. He claimed familiarity with relevant Persian historical texts, Eastern histories. He also used a Persian manuscript about the state of the Mughal Empire before the invasion that had been sent to a prominent London physician and collector, Dr. Richard Mead, to whom Fraser dedicated the book. And he incorporated an account from an Englishman who had lived in Persia and apparently knew Nadir Shah personally.
So, a compilation based on various sources, textual and anecdotal.
Pretty much.
Yeah.
And this publication gave him a certain reputation. When he returned to India in 1743, he came back not just as a company servant, but as a published author, a savant, and a known collector. He got good financial terms with the company.
And he was involved in local politics in Surat.
Yes, he seems to have been quite involved in dealings with the local Mughal administration, the Darbar. The force mentions figures like the governor Tagbeg Khan treating him with familiarity, suggesting he had built relationships. His language skills were valuable.
In what way?
He was called upon to translate documents for the company, and apparently his knowledge was good enough that he could even detect forged documents. He also reconnected with the merchant communities in Surat he knew from his first posting.
But his career took a downturn towards the end.
It did. By 1747, things had gone sour. The source highlights a long, bitter complaint letter Fraser wrote to the EIC directors in London. He blamed his problems squarely on the uncommon resentment of the governor of Bombay, William Wake, under whom Surat fell.
Why the resentment? What was the conflict about?
Fraser claimed it was because he, Fraser, had opposed measures Wake was pursuing that Fraser believed were contrary to the interest of the honorable company. He painted Wake as a slippery character, deeply involved in his own private trade deals, having secret arrangements with a high-ranking Dutch official, Jacob Mossel, and getting tangled up in some complex affair involving the French and Portuguese.
Did Fraser give specific examples of Wake's poor judgment?
Yes, and one is quite revealing about Fraser's own views on Indian society. He criticized Wake for giving a colonel's commission in the company's forces to a paltry banyan, a Bunia merchant named Jagannathas Laldas, putting him in command over soldiers. Fraser identified as Turks, Arabs, and Moors, Muslims.
Why did Fraser object to that?
He called it a ridiculous mistake that showed Wake's total ignorance of Indian customs. Fraser argued that these martial groups would hold a Banyan commander with contempt and pity and would never fight effectively under him. It shows Fraser's own ingrained understanding, perhaps stereotypical, but based on his experience of the perceived social and martial hierarchies in India at the time.
Beyond these career struggles, Fraser is really remembered for something else, isn't he?
Yes, his most lasting legacy is his incredible collection of Persian manuscripts. It's considered one of the most important early collections of its kind brought to Europe, and much of it is now in the Bodleian Library at Oxford.
What kind of texts did he collect?
The source lists his own classification categories: history, poetry, ethics, and stories, sciences and arts, dictionaries, letter-writing manuals, inshaja, and beliefs. His history section was particularly strong.
What makes his history collections so significant?
He managed to acquire a remarkable number of major Mughal historical chronicles, many of which were appearing in a European collection for the very first time.
Like which ones?
Works like Mir Kwan's General History, Tarikh-i Razad al-Safa, a summary of the Arabic Chronicle of Tabari, histories of the Delhi Sultanates like the Tarikh-i Haqi, Banu Qadi's history, and crucially, major official histories of the Mughal emperors, Abu Fazl's Akbarnama about Akbar, Nizamuddin Ahmad's Tabaqat-i Akbar Shahi, Abdul Hamid Lahori's Pachahnama about Shah Jahan, Kamgar Hussaini's Ma'asi Jahangiri about Jahangir, the Persian translation of Babur's own memoirs, Waqiyat-i Baburi, Jahangir's memoirs, Waqiyat-i Jahangiri, and Munshi Muhammad Kazim's Alamgirnama about Aurangzeb.
Wow, that's like a greatest hits of Mughal historical writing. It shows a really serious effort to engage with how the Mughals recorded their own history.
It absolutely does. It demonstrates a deep interest in understanding the Mughal state and its past, through its own textual tradition. Interestingly, the source notes his collection didn't include Muhammad Kazim Farishta's famous chronicle, which was already known and considered prestigious in Europe. But the sheer breadth of what he did acquire is remarkable for the time.
Okay, let's move to another fascinating figure who engaged deeply with Indian knowledge systems, Antoine Polier. He wasn't British, was he?
No, he was Franco-Swiss. His family background was Huguenot French Protestants who had fled persecution after the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre and settled in Lausanne, Switzerland. This background sometimes caused him trouble in his career with the British East India Company.
How so?
The source mentions that the pretext of his foreign origins was sometimes used against him, leading to discrimination or blocking his advancement, even though he served the company for years.
So he needed patrons.
Yes, unlike some other Europeans interested in Oriental studies, like Jean-Baptiste Gentil, who worked closely with the scholar Anquetil Duperron. Polier navigated the EIC system by cultivating powerful English patrons, most notably Robert Clive and Warren Hastings.
And he became quite integrated into the Indian world.
Deeply embedded. He had an extraordinary career working for the company but also serving Indian rulers like Shujo Dalla of Awadh. He lived in a fascinating milieu, interacting closely with Indian elites. He even produced a Persian letter book, the Ayijaz-e-Arsalani, in collaboration with his Indian secretary or scribe, Munshi Kishan Sahay.
That's just a close working relationship, a kind of co-production of knowledge.
It hints at that, yes. Polier shared the typical Orientalist interests of the time. He actively sought out manuscripts of Indian texts, including the Upanishads, just as Gentil was doing for Anquetil back in Europe.
The source gives a really specific example of how Polier collaborated with an Indian informant to learn about religion and culture.
This is a standout passage. Polier himself describes finding a key interlocutor as a happy chance. This man, whom Polier calls Ramchand, was Sikh, from what Polier describes as the noble Khatri tribe.
And Ramchand was already connected to European scholars.
Remarkably, yes. Polier notes that Ramchand had previously been an instructor to Sir William Jones, the famous Orientalist scholar and judge in Calcutta, whom Polier knew and corresponded with.
Small world. What else did Polier say about Ramchand?
He lived near Lahore, was apparently well-traveled in northern and western India. Polier notes that while Ramchand wasn't a Brahmin and thus didn't have exclusive access to certain types of ritual instruction, as a Khatri he did have the right to hear the sacred books read aloud.
And he had the right qualities to be a good teacher.
Polier certainly thought so. He praised Ramchand's prodigious memory with a great deal of intelligence, of order, of clarity of mind. He was apparently very well versed in poetry, and particularly in the Puranas, the texts rich in Hindu mythology.
Did Ramchand work alone with Polier?
No, and this is important. Polier explains that Ramchand constantly consulted two Brahmins, who were part of his own retinue or household, on difficult points or details. So the knowledge Polier received was mediated through Ramchand, who in turn was drawing on Brahminical expertise.
So it wasn't just one European asking one Indian, it was a network.
Exactly. A clear case of knowledge co-production. Polier says Ramchand instructed him in depth, not only about Sikh religion and history, which Ramchand's own background, but also extensively on Hindu mythology, explaining the close ties between the two traditions. It's a fantastic illustration of a European actively trying to learn from an Indian knowledge system, facilitated by a trusted intermediary and his scholarly network.
Polier also put a lot of effort into acquiring actual texts, like the Vedas.
He did. He recounts trying to get a complete copy of the Vedas while he was in Jaipur. This wasn't easy at all.
Why not?
Because obtaining such sacred texts required explicit permission from the ruler, Maharaja Sawai Pratap Singh. Polier couldn't just commission a copy directly.
How did he navigate that?
He wrote a formal request to the Maharaja. His friend, Don Pedro da Silva, who was, interestingly, a Portuguese physician employed in the Raja's service, acted as an intermediary and delivered the letter.
What was the argument they used to persuade the Maharaja?
Da Silva apparently explained Polier's request by saying that Europeans like to collect rare and valuable books for their public libraries, and that the Vedas were particularly hard to find, but highly sought after by scholars. He stressed that without the Raja's express order, the Brahmins wouldn't dare make a copy for a European.
And did it work?
Yes. Polier writes that the Raja smiled when he read the letter, supposedly asking what possible use Europeans could have for their holy books, but he immediately gave the order allowing it. Polier then had to pay the Brahmin scribes a certain rate per stanza for the painstaking work of transcription. It took about a year, but he eventually obtained the complete set.
That story really underscores the challenges, doesn't it? Needing intermediaries, understanding local politics, getting official permission, the time, the expense. It wasn't just a simple transaction to acquire this kind of deep cultural knowledge or artifact.
Not at all. These collections were often the result of intricate social negotiations, diplomacy, and collaborative effort, sometimes spanning years. Now, let's consider one more Scottish figure, Alexander Walker, who was active a bit later, bridging the late 18th and early 19th centuries.
Walker was another East India Company man, administrator and collector.
That's him. He had a long career in Asia after joining the EIC in 1780. He even participated in an exploratory voyage to the northwest coast of America early on. But his main Indian service was in the south, particularly Kerala in the late 18th century, and then quite significantly in Gujarat and Baroda in the early 19th century, where he served as the British political resident.
He's known in British colonial history for one particular campaign, isn't he?
Yes, he's often highlighted, sometimes celebrated for his efforts in the early 1800s towards the suppression of female infanticide, a practice prevalent among certain Jadeja Rajput clans in the Kathiawar region of Gujarat. His friend, Edward Moore, who wrote a book called Hindu Infanticide in 1811, dedicated it to Walker, praising their joint work for the public good.
What motivated Walker to engage closely with Indian people and culture? Did he write about it?
He did. In a preface written later, reflecting on his time in India, he mentioned that in remote postings, the natives were my only society. He seems to have genuinely found their conversation amusing and interesting, and made an effort to learn about their manners and habits. He believed he gained their trust by convincing them I had their good at heart. He specifically valued interactions with what he called men of rank, of education, or of property, whose minds he felt hadn't been corrupted by long political subjection.
He was also a massive collector of documents.
An extraordinary collector. His papers, now mainly in the National Library of Scotland and the Bodleian, cover a huge range of topics related to Indian society, politics, religion, and customs. He apparently spent time reworking and organizing these volumes when he was later appointed governor of the remote island of St. Helena. Maybe he had a lot of time on his hands there.
Did he collect visual materials as well?
Yes. He commissioned a series of drawings bound into a volume titled An Account of Various Hindu Deities. These were done by an Indian artist and include notations in Nagari and Kannada scripts. The source compares his collection to the much larger collection of drawings amassed by Colin Mackenzie around the same time.
How do they differ?
Mackenzie's project was more systematic, explicitly part of the early colonial state's massive effort to survey and gather information about its territories. Walker's collection, while created within the context of his official position, seems to have been driven more by his personal initiative and interests. Ironically, the source suggests Walker's drawings are sometimes considered to have a more secure provenance or legacy.
Did Walker write about his understanding of things like Indian religion or caste?
He definitely engaged with the topic of caste. And interestingly, like Fraser perhaps, he seemed resistant to the overly simplistic generalizations that were becoming common. He explicitly called it a mistaken notion that these establishments in India are perpetual and immutable.
So he didn't see caste as this timeless, unchanging system.
Apparently not. He viewed caste institutions as something that followed the progress of society, evolving as civil or religious institutions designed to meet the needs of people living collectively as they advanced in civilization. He emphasized the general nature of caste, perhaps suggesting flexibility or variation rather than rigid uniformity.
Did he learn Indian languages himself, like Sanskrit?
The source says it's unclear if he knew Sanskrit well. It's considered likely that, similar to Polier, he relied heavily on a Brahmin interlocutor for detailed information on religious and textual matters. A name mentioned in his papers is Gangadhar Patwardhan Sastri. This again points to the crucial role of these Indian experts in shaping European knowledge.
Walker also held some pretty strong views about contemporary Indian rulers like Tipu Sultan of Mysore.
Very strong and generally quite negative views of Tipu. After Tipu was killed by the British in 1799, Walker wrote a particularly severe obituary. He contrasted the tyrannous Tipu with his father, Haidar Ali Khan, whom Walker portrayed more positively, praising Haidar's liberality and the open, manly appearance.
What was Walker's take on Tipu's religious policies?
He painted Tipu as a religious fanatic, persecuting both Hindus and Christians. Interestingly, the source notes that Walker's views on this seemed to harden over time, becoming more pronounced in the 1790s as conflict with Tipu intensified.
Had he thought differently earlier?
In 1789, Walker had actually noted that many high-ranking Muslims, Mormon in Tipu's service, disliked him, and that Tipu seemed to place his greatest trust in Brahmins and Rajputs for important positions.
But by 1800, his assessment was much harsher.
Yes. By then, Walker was describing Tipu's restless mind, his continual projects, his vindictive temper, and his system of cruelty. Adding to this his childish superstition and a blind zeal for the faith of Muhammad.
Did he still acknowledge Tipu's reliance on Brahmins?
He did, but he gave it a negative spin. Walker suggested Tipu only trusted Brahmins because he believed they could get supernatural knowledge from the devil, and so he consulted them as demoniacs. It's a stark example of how existing biases could twist observations, acknowledging the fact of Brahmin employment, but interpreting the motive in the most negative, prejudiced way possible. Walker also used things like population statistics from places like Tanjavur to argue about the devastating impact of Tipu's military campaigns.
Okay, we spent a lot of time looking at how various Europeans perceived India, their methods, their biases, their collections. Now let's flip the coin. How did Indians view these Europeans, these Franks as they were often called?
That's crucial, and the source provides some really powerful insights. In the early centuries, especially the 15th and 16th, from the perspective of many Indian observers, particularly those writing in Persian and Arabic chronicles, these Europeans often seemed to appear out of the blue, and their impact was frequently seen as violent and disruptive.
They weren't viewed positively.
Often quite the opposite. They were frequently described as violent, devious, untrustworthy, masters of chicanery or trickery.
The account by Zainuddin Mabari about the Portuguese in Malabar sounds particularly brutal.
It's incredibly damning. Zainuddin, writing in the 16th century, framed the arrival of the Portuguese almost as a divine punishment visited upon the Muslims of the Malabar coast because they had sinned and forgotten God's blessings. He then lists a catalog of Portuguese atrocities and ignoble acts.
What kind of act?
Things like forcibly dragging vessels ashore, showing utter disrespect to local people, throwing sludge, spitting on them, ruining legitimate trade, deliberately obstructing the Hajj pilgrimage to Mecca, robbing pilgrims, burning ships, cities, and mosques, desecrating the Holy Quran, profaning sanctuaries, trying to force people to convert by offering bribes to adore the cross, stealing jewels and dresses from Muslim women to adorn European women, assassinating pilgrims, insulting the Prophet Muhammad, and capturing and enslaving Muslims.
Wow. That paints a picture of complete barbarity and religious persecution. A stark contrast to how the Portuguese likely saw their own mission.
Absolutely worlds apart. And this perception of European deceitfulness wasn't isolated. The source highlights a recurring story, a kind of narrative trope that appears in various Indian texts from different regions.
You mean the story about the bull's hide?
Exactly. The tale where the Portuguese, or sometimes other Europeans, ask a local ruler for just enough land to lay out a single bull's hide. The ruler agrees, thinking it's a tiny request. But then the Europeans cleverly cut the hide into one extremely thin, long strip and use it to measure out and enclose a huge area of land on which they promptly build a fort.
Where does this story appear?
It's found in the Mughal Chronicle by Lahori, in a Sinhala text from Sri Lanka called the Mahabharata, and even in a Malay text describing the fall of Malacca to the Portuguese. Its widespread nature suggests it became a powerful shorthand, a symbol across different cultures for perceived European cunning and trickery used to gain territory.
Are there other examples of this perceived treachery?
The source mentions the controversial death of Sultan Bahadur Shah of Gujarat in 1537. He died after visiting the ship of the Portuguese governor Nuno da Cunha. While the exact circumstances are debated by historians in many Indian accounts, it was presented as a clear case of the Portuguese treacherously killing the Sultan after luring him onto their vessel. It reinforced that negative stereotype.
Okay, so violence and deceit were common themes. What about Indian interest in European knowledge or technology? Were they curious about things like European maps, globes, or illustrations?
This is an interesting point of debate among historians. Some early European accounts, like that of Sir Thomas Roe, the English ambassador to Jahangir's court, suggest a degree of Mughal indifference. Roe famously described giving Jahangir maps made by the great cartographer Mercator, and the emperor supposedly questioned their scale and accuracy, seeming unimpressed.
But not all historians agree with this picture of indifference.
No. Scholars like Ahsan Jan Kaisar argue it's implausible that sophisticated courts like the Mughals wouldn't have been curious about European maps. And indeed, Kaisar points out that soon after Roe's visit, other Mughal nobles were asking the Dutch factor Pelsart for maps, specifically requesting a map of the world.
Is there any evidence of European cartography influencing Indian map-making?
There is some. The source mentions an atlas compiled by an Iranian scholar in India, Sadiq Isfahani, around 1647. While it largely follows the traditional Islamic cartographic convention, like placing south at the top, it does show some signs of European influence in how it depicts the world, suggesting some knowledge exchange was happening. So the idea of complete Mughal indifference to European empirical knowledge seems unlikely.
Did Europeans appear in Indian imagination in other ways, maybe less political or empirical?
Yes, sometimes they popped up in more fantastical contexts, almost like figures from the Arabian Nights. The source mentions stories, like one about an Iraqi traveler meeting the Emperor of the Franks, which involved marvels, mirabilia, and monsters. This suggests that for some Indian audiences, Franks still occupied a space similar to how Europeans imagined distant non-European lands potentially full of wonders and strange beings.
Let's look at a more detailed Indian perspective. The source discusses Tahir Muhammad's account from Essa in Sumatra, dating to the early 17th century. What was his view of the Portuguese and Franks?
Tahir Muhammad starts with a somewhat hazy geographical description, calling Portugal a very large city, the capital of the Emperor of Franks, located near the frontier of the Maghreb, North Africa. But his account quickly gets dominated by wonders and extraordinary tales.
What kind of wonders?
He tells a story about a huge cave somewhere in the Maghreb inhabited by jinns, where someone became a master of magical arts. He then links this to European politics, recounting the famous Battle of Alcácer Quibir, or Battle of the Three Kings, in Morocco in 1578, where King Dom Sebastian of Portugal was defeated and killed.
The fate of Dom Sebastian became a legend in Portugal, didn't it? The idea he might return one day.
Exactly. And Tahir Muhammad's account reflects the uncertainty and rumors surrounding his death. He notes that some Franks claim Sebastian wasn't dead, just imprisoned. He then tells a story about Sebastian's successor, his great-uncle Cardinal Dom Henrique, ordering the magical cave to be opened. Clairvoyants, who had supposedly been inside for 7 years, emerged and finally confirmed that Sebastian was indeed dead.
It's fascinating that these events in faraway Portugal and Morocco were being discussed and woven into narratives in places like Asia, and even, as the source notes, at the Mughal court, where the Jesuit Antonio Montserrat observed interest in Dom Henrique.
It shows the interconnectedness of news and rumor across the globe even then. But beyond these fantastical elements, Tahir Muhammad also expressed some very pointed negative stereotypes about the Franks.
What were they?
He repeats the idea of them being cowards on land but brave in water. He saw them as fundamentally untrustworthy, devious, but his sharpest criticisms were about their personal habits.
This is a hygiene issue again.
Yes, and he's very explicit. He describes the Franks as dirty, unbathed, and worst of all, lacking in proper forms of toilet training.
That's incredibly blunt. It really highlights how deeply ingrained cultural norms around cleanliness and bodily functions were, and how violations of those norms could form the basis for strong negative judgments.
It absolutely does. It wasn't just about politics or religion. It was about fundamental daily practices. However, despite these harsh views, Tahir Muhammad wasn't entirely dismissive of Frankish abilities.
He acknowledged some skills.
He admitted that navigation was one area the Franks had clearly mastered. And he described, perhaps with a mix of observation and myth, some of their clever devices for dealing with perils at sea.
Like what?
He mentioned a technique against whirlpools. Seeing threatening clouds, they'd fire a cannon, and the sound would somehow dissipate the clouds and prevent the whirlpool. He also described the phenomena of St. Elmo's fire, a special flame appearing on the ship, and how the Franks dealt with it. And his solution for sharks was quite something. Throw a bag into the sea, the shark swallows it and is made contented, thus stopping it from attacking the ship.
Okay, some of those sound more like sailors' tales than accurate descriptions, but it shows he was observing and trying to understand their maritime world.
Yes, a mix of respect for their skills and perhaps a touch of the exotic or magical in explaining them.
As we move into the 18th century, did these negative Indian perceptions continue?
The source suggests they did, and perhaps even intensified in some literary portrayals. It mentions a late 18th century Sanskrit text from South India, Venkatadvaran Sarvadeva Vilasa, which apparently compares the Yuvatamukha's literally white faces, a term for Europeans, to the figure of Ravana, the demon king villain of the Ramayana epic. That's a pretty strong negative association.
And you mentioned earlier that even the Mughal Emperor Shah Jahan had reportedly commented on European lack of cleanliness back in the 17th century.
Yes, the source refers to an anecdote about Shah Jahan noticing their lack of bodily cleanliness during a banquet in Lahore. This echoes Tahir Muhammad's comments and suggests that this particular stereotype, based on differing cultural norms of hygiene, had real persistence among some Indian observers.
We've talked about Europeans traveling to India. What about the reverse? Did any Indians travel to Europe during this period and record their impressions?
Yes, the source provides a fascinating account from a group of Syro-Malabar Christians from Kerala in southwest India. They undertook a long and difficult journey to Lisbon and Rome in the late 1770s to petition the church authorities there directly about issues facing their community. One member of the group, Tamakadanar, Puramakal Tamakathanar, wrote a detailed account of their experiences in Malayalam, the Vartamana Pustakam.
What did they think of Europe? What were their impressions of Lisbon?
Tamakadanar's description of Lisbon is quite critical. He found it noisy, crowded, disorderly. Perhaps still recovering from the devastating earthquake of 1755, he felt it lacked a clear plan. He was struck by the sheer number of churches and their immense wealth, second only to Rome, he thought. But he also noted things he saw as problems, like the large number of illegitimate children being cared for in charitable institutions.
Did they encounter difficulties there?
Yes, particularly with what they saw as the excessive influence of Catholic priests from Goa, like the famous Abbe Faria, though this might be a different Faria. These figures, they felt, created obstacles and made it hard for the Kerala delegation to get an audience with the Queen of Portugal to present their petition.
What about Rome?
His description of Rome is characterized by the source as somewhat perfunctory or brief. He notes its circular layout, leveled ground, walls, and gates. He mentions St. Peter's Basilica and other religious buildings, but doesn't go into great detail. He also notes the presence of rich merchants, pleasant gardens, and comic actors.
But the overall feeling wasn't positive.
No, the source describes the overall tone of the Vardhamana Pustakam as sour and disappointed. Tamakadanar felt that the church authorities they dealt with in both Lisbon and Rome had ultimately disregarded justice and the glory of God, acting instead out of self-interest and pride.
They were involved in complex church politics, weren't they?
Deeply. Their account details a protracted struggle involving endless petitions, counter-petitions, audiences with cardinals and officials, and what they perceived as constant, vile machinations by their opponents, particularly the Carmelite missionaries who held authority over their church in Kerala.
They felt distrusted.
Very much so. They complained that the high authorities in Rome and Lisbon gave little credence to their side of the story, preferring the versions presented by the European Carmelites. Fierce letters were exchanged. The Kerala delegation accused their European superiors of using deceit and tricks, of robbing their community's traditional dignities, of effectively enslaving them, and of trying to abolish their ancient rites and customs inherited from St. Thomas the Apostle.
That's strong language. Did they frame their arguments in a particular way?
They used what the source calls a form of patriotic reasoning. To argue against the appointment of European bishops and authorities over the Syro-Malabar Church, they drew analogies that they hoped Europeans would understand.
Like what?
They asked, would the Portuguese accept being ruled by the Spanish Habsburgs again? Would Italians accept being governed by Portuguese? Would Germans accept French rule? Their point was that it's a law of nature, that the honor and the unity of a community can be kept intact only if that community is governed by those of that community.
That's a powerful argument for self-governance, using concepts of natural law and national identity that were current in Europe itself.
It's quite sophisticated. They even use biblical parallels, comparing the European authorities to the Pharaoh oppressing the Israelites, the Malabarians. It's unclear how effective these arguments were in persuading the authorities in Rome and Lisbon, but they certainly showed the intellectual tools the Kerala Christians employed to critique European dominance and assert their own identity and rights.
Did their trip achieve anything in the end?
After immense difficulty and negotiation, they did manage to secure permission to sail back, and they achieved a major goal: the nomination of one of their own leaders, Malpan Joseph Karyatul, as the Archbishop of Cranganore, representing a significant step towards greater autonomy.
How was their journey back?
Also fraught with difficulty. They ended up sailing on a convict transport ship from Lisbon. They survived a terrifying storm as they entered the harbor of Bahia in Brazil. Interestingly, Tamakadanar notes that in Brazil, they were treated with exemplary respect by the local authorities and people, suggesting variations in reception even within the Portuguese colonial world.
So, this whole deep dive, looking at both European and Indian perspectives over 3 centuries, really paints a picture of incredible complexity, doesn't it? It's not a simple narrative at all.
Not even close. I think the main takeaway from Subramaniam's work, as presented here, is that the relationship, the understanding, the perception between Europeans and Indians from 1500 to 1800 was constantly shifting, layered, sometimes intense, sometimes indifferent, and almost always marked by what the source calls distinct asymmetries in perception. Power dynamics played a huge role.
And that process of trying to understand each other, what the source calls cultural translation, was never straightforward.
Never transparent. It couldn't be, because the people involved, the European travelers, missionaries, officials, merchants, and their Indian counterparts, informants, collaborators, critics, were themselves complex individuals caught up in their own cultural assumptions, political agendas, personal ambitions, and webs of relationships. They weren't neutral conduits of information.
We saw how European strategies evolved over time.
Yeah, from those early attempts at philology and ethnography, often leading to bold, sometimes simplistic generalizations, like the idea of inherent Mughal despotism, or a single systemic Indian religion based on caste.
Through the 17th century, with its debates and the persistence of casual, often prejudiced ethnography alongside more sophisticated, sometimes deceptive strategies like Bernier's adroit dissimulation.
Right, and then that significant shift in the 18th century. As European political and military power grew, especially British power, the dynamic changed.
How so?
One interesting point the source makes is a kind of reversal of stereotypes. Whereas early Indian accounts often accused Europeans of being deceitful and untrustworthy, Forbes, by the later 18th century, it was increasingly Europeans accusing Indians, particularly those they dealt with politically, of being inherently duplicitous and unreliable.
A projection, perhaps, of their own earlier tactics.
Possibly, or simply a convenient justification for exercising greater control. But amidst all this conflict, misunderstanding, and strategic maneuvering, there were those moments of genuine learning, weren't there?
Yes, those quite pregnant moments, as the source calls them, where some Europeans genuinely tried to apprentice themselves to Indian knowledge systems.
Like Polier, working closely with Ramchand and his Grauman network to understand Hindu mythology and Sikhism, or Walker likely relying on Gangadhar Sastry to navigate the complexities of caste and religion, or Fraser dedicating himself to collecting and understanding Mughal historical chronicles in Persian.
These efforts required real work, didn't they? And maybe a degree of humility.
Definitely. It wasn't easy knowledge to acquire. It required building relationships, navigating cultural protocols, often learning difficult languages, and acknowledging the expertise of Indian informants. But the source suggests this kind of apprenticeship became harder, or perhaps less common, as European dominance solidified towards the end of our period.
Why was that?
With growing power came a different set of attitudes, particularly within the burgeoning colonial administration and institutions like the Asiatic Society, founded in Calcutta in 1784. The source describes this later attitude as a combination of ill-disguised contempt, a growing impatience, and an urge to infantilize the other, and a tendency to generalize from Olympian heights.
Less listening, more dictating.
Perhaps. A sense that Europeans now held the keys to knowledge and civilization, and Indians were subjects to be studied, classified, and managed rather than intellectual partners.
And this shift didn't go unnoticed by Indian observers.
Not at all. The source includes a wonderful sarcastic critique from Mirza Abu Talib Khan, an Indian scholar who traveled to Europe around 1800. He commented on the English publishing industry, saying they seemed to quickly compose works containing little worth, which were then circulated widely by the printing press like toys bestowed on children. He found they amused the ignorant, but were useless to the truly learned.
And he applied this even to famous Orientalist scholars.
Yes, the source notes he directed this sarcasm even towards someone like Sir William Jones, who was revered by Europeans for his linguistic abilities and scholarship. Abu Talib's critique reflects a deep skepticism about the depth and value of some European knowledge production about India, seeing it as perhaps rapid and superficial compared to older traditions of learning.
The source suggests this kind of critique signals a breakdown of the older cultural balance.
Yes, a breakdown of inequilibrium where interactions, while complex, perhaps had more constraints or required more negotiation. Abu Talib's comments reflect a world where European power was becoming overwhelming, and the terms of intellectual engagement were fundamentally changing.
So reflecting on all these layers, the misunderstandings, the attempts at connection, the shifting power dynamics, the biases on both sides, it leaves you with a lot to think about regarding cross-cultural encounters in general.
It really does.
Considering these vastly different, often flawed, and frequently self-serving historical perspectives we've discussed, what does that really tell you, listening now, about the fundamental challenge of truly understanding another culture, whether centuries ago or even today in our supposedly connected world?
Or maybe think about it this way. How might the way information about other places and peoples is collected, interpreted, and shared today still reflect subtle, or maybe not so subtle, imbalances of power and perspective, much like we saw happening between Europe and India back then? It's definitely food for thought.
Absolutely. And if this deep dive has piqued your interest and you want to explore further, there are so many avenues. You could definitely try to find out more about some of the incredible individuals we mentioned: Bernier, Polier, Walker, Fraser, or even figures like Tahir Mohammed or Tama Katanar.
Or you could look into the broader history of the European East India companies, the English, Dutch, French, to understand the larger economic and political context. You might also seek out translations of some of the key texts mentioned, like Duarte Barbosa's early account of Kerala, or perhaps the travel narratives of Abu Talib Khan or the Vartamana Pustakam.
There's a whole world of historical perspective out there waiting to be explored. We hope this has given you a richer understanding of a complex and crucial period. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive into Europe's India.
Thank you.